The latest rumblings coming out of the NFL Combine in Indianapolis could be really good news for a certain sector of Broncos country. But before we talk about that, guys, I want to shout out the affiliate partner for today's video, Whitebeard Signworks. Use code BS30, link in the description below, to save $30 off your first purchase on NFL LED team logo signs, just like this really cool sign behind me. Again, that is code BS30, link in the description below to save $30 off your first purchase from Whitebeard Signworks. Thank you so much to them. And now back to your regularly scheduled content. If you are in Camp Ashton Jeanty to Denver, then I've got some good news for you. Bringing in this tweet from Ryan Fowler at the Draft Network, the following teams have formal meetings scheduled with Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty at the Combine: Giants, Broncos, Vikings, Steelers, Colts, Bears, Chargers, Ravens, and Saints. So the Denver Broncos clearly have some level of interest in Ashton Jeanty, and that would align with what I have heard through the grapevine. Who wouldn't have interest in Ashton Jeanty? He's a potentially generational player at the running back position, and the Broncos have had a lackluster run game for the last several seasons. Jeanty would immediately elevate that to the next level. But if you read between the lines and kind of peel back the layers of the onion, you'll realize that it's probably not likely the Denver Broncos end up with Ashton Jeanty. The first reason, and probably the most obvious reason, is he's not going to be available for the Denver Broncos to draft with the 20th overall pick. He's going to be long gone by that point. I have heard that he's not going to last much further than the Dallas Cowboys with the number 12 overall pick. That just feels like a Jerry Jones draft pick through and through, but I've heard maybe he'll even go earlier than that. I've heard as high as 6 overall with the Las Vegas Raiders, especially if the Raiders go out and sign a veteran quarterback like a Sam Darnold or maybe a Matthew Stafford. Then Ashton Jeanty would make a ton of sense for them. He would give them a dynamic offensive weapon, a Joker-type player, just like what Sean Payton has talked about for the last several weeks. He reiterated that point today in his press conference in Indianapolis, that the Denver Broncos need to add Joker-type players, and tight end and running back are the two positions where you find Joker-type players. Don't get me wrong, if Ashton Jeanty somehow slipped through the cracks and the rest of the NFL got stupid, quite frankly, and he ended up falling to number 20 overall or within striking distance to trade up to get him, then I think the Denver Broncos would pounce. But Sean Payton also said today that the NFL draft is deep this year with running backs. It's not just a top-heavy draft where Ashton Jeanty's the only good player. Anyone who's followed the draft knows that there are a lot of good players out there. You've got your Omarion Hamptons of the world, you've got your Caleb Johnsons, your Quinshon Judkins, your Travion Hendersons, and there's a lot of other really good players that I haven't named as well. This is a very deep class where you can find a few of those Joker-type players outside of Jeanty. Another reason that I'm hoping the Denver Broncos will steer clear of Jeanty is I'm hoping that they will have already addressed the running back position in free agency. NFL teams like to fill their needs, their immediate, direct needs, through free agency. That way you are free in the draft to take the best player available. And I think the Denver Broncos have been one of the shining examples of this, dating back to 2021 when George Payton took over as GM. His first draft is a perfect example of this, where they already had Ronald Darby, who they had just signed in free agency, as well as Kyle Fuller, and they had Bryce Callahan at nickel. What did they do, though? They ended up drafting Pat Surtain with the 9th overall pick in the draft, and he was the best player available at that time, and he has turned into the best player on this entire team. Then you look at a little bit later on in the draft in the 3rd round, where guard was not a need for them. They already had a pair of established starting guards in Dalton Risner and Graham Glasgow. But they ended up taking Quinn Miners, and he developed into arguably the best guard in the NFL right now. Then, later on in the draft, they ended up taking Baron Browning earlier on in that draft, but they still felt they needed more depth at edge rusher. And mind you, at this time, Von Miller and Bradley Chubb were still on the roster. They still had both of those guys. What did they do? They drafted Jonathan Cooper in the 7th round. I understand that was more of a flyer, but he turned into a starting level player for them that they just extended on a big budget extension. So even if you don't have these immediate needs that you can fill in the draft, you just have the philosophy of taking best player available, and you're probably going to end up getting good results. And that has been the philosophy that the Denver Broncos have followed ever since George Paton has gotten here as GM. And Howie Roseman is another perfect example of this, where they fill their immediate direct needs in free agency. And if they are going to fill a need that might be coming up in the draft, they usually do it 1 year before it actually becomes a big pressing need for them. You think about how they had drafted Jason Kelce's replacement twice, actually. They drafted Landon Dickerson first, thinking he would be Kelce's replacement. Dickerson ended up becoming an all-pro guard for them instead. They then drafted Cam Jurgens, who after starting for a year at guard, eventually did take over for Kelce at center, and he became a Pro Bowl player at the center position this year. So that's just kind of the philosophy that these good general managers like the Howie Rosemans of the world and like the George Patons of the world, that's the philosophy that they like to follow, is fill your needs in free agency. That way you can go BPA in the draft. And if you are filling a need in the draft, do it 1 year before that need comes up. So that's why I'm hoping the Broncos will have already signed like an Aaron Jones or a Najee Harris, somebody like that in free agency. That way you have that need plugged. That way when the draft gets here, let's say that the best player available is a defensive tackle, for example. The Broncos would be free to go in that direction because you don't have that festering immediate need of running back or tight end. I think it's a similar situation at the tight end position, where I'm hoping they sign free agents, a couple of free agent tight ends. That way, if Colson Loveland is the best player available at 20, you're free to take him, and that's a good thing. Even if you sign a couple tight ends in free agency, you can still take Loveland, and he'll probably develop into a future starter for you, just like Pat Surtain did, and just like Quinn Miners did. Don't be afraid to take the best player available, even if you don't think it's a, quote, position of need. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. Obviously, the Denver Broncos are not drafting a quarterback high this year. That's very apparent. They're probably not going to draft an offensive tackle high this year. But outside of that, I think any position is available here for the taking for the Denver Broncos. And if Ashton Jeanty falls and he's the best player available, then you take him. Otherwise, I don't think that you want to put a whole lot of time or effort into trying to trade up to get him. It's just not worth it. There are other good backs, and you're sacrificing taking possibly an even better player a little bit later on, and it's just not worth it, man. You'd be giving up an extra pick to trade up for Jeanty. So if he falls to you, great. Otherwise, you've got good players that are still available on the board, and you go in that direction. All right, guys, be sure to leave a like on this video as well as subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment section below, guys. How do you guys feel about the Denver Broncos meeting with Ashton Jeanty? And I should also say this. This is the time of year where any report that such and such player met with Team X at the Combine, we shouldn't really be reading too much into that to begin with, because at some point, pretty much every team is going to meet with every prospect. They are. They're going to get information on these players because they want to get a gauge on who they are. They want to answer any remaining questions that their tape might not have answered, or any remaining questions about medicals. That wouldn't apply in this case here with Jeanty. But this is the time of year where even if you're not interested in drafting a player, you're still going to meet with him, because maybe 3 or 4 years down the road, that player will become available as a free agent or through a trade. You still want to know what you thought about the player. So you go back and you reference your notes from earlier on when you scouted them and be like, okay, we liked this about this player. We didn't like this about this player, blah, 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 blah. And that's how you make a more informed decision. Also, you're potentially going to be facing these guys as opponents at some point down the road. You want to get some idea of what these guys are as players. That's why teams have meetings with players and positions that they're not even thinking about drafting, because they still could end up finding a player that they really like, or they have information in the reserves for later on when they might need it. All right, guys, be sure to leave a like on this video as well as subscribe to the channel. And until next time, guys, I am your host, Gage Madrid, saying peace out.